Okay, everyone, we're ready to resume. If you could please take your seats. Our next presenter is Arleyn Levee, an independent scholar and honorary ASLA member. Most recently, Arleyn worked with the Cultural Landscape Foundation to author the book Experiencing Olmsted, the Enduring Legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted's North American Landscapes. Arleyn's presentation is titled From Regional Plans to Cemetery Plots, the Olmsted Brothers' Work on Long Island. Arleyn.
It is awesome to follow my two favorite people who spoke before. It's also a little intimidating. So, in any event, oh, good. It's already there. I should be looking ahead of me. Just a caveat to begin with. This is, you've had some very thoughtful essays. I'm giving you a quick travelogue, and there'll be lots of questions that you all need to go and dig up the answers to. So, exploring the extraordinary canon of Olmsted projects on Long Island stemmed from a 2007 visit to Memorial Cemetery of St. John in Cold Spring Harbor and to Locust Valley Cemetery in Locust Valley to explore the cache of Olmsted commissions clustered there. This was and remains a truly revelatory experience. A world apart from most cemetery experiences. As you see in the lower right, that's what the cemetery was like in its older section. With their picturesque, irregular terrain and winding drives, the concentration of individualized rooms revealed an unexpected skill and subtlety of the landscape craft, which my research had identified as the Olmsted work. Nestled into the wooded hillsides and valleys, these memorials, enclosed by plantings, though less layered than they were intended, still conveyed spatial artistry, a serenity and intimacy that was inspiring. And what a noble collection of interrees in these places. A swath of America's financial, political, and cultural leadership, as well as more humble citizens of the local hamlets. Thus intrigued, I proceeded to work backwards from the cemetery plots, which are, after all, a residential complex of sorts, to explore the connection these individuals had to the Olmsted firm and to each other in this New York locale, and if the Olmsted firm had worked with them on other landscapes, what had become of the properties. Now, I have to admit that I'm the New York visitor, the little kid who was in the back of the unair-conditioned car that was stuck going to the beach for 3 hours, come back itchy and sandy. And I had no idea about anything else about Long Island. The geomorphic splendor of this 118 miles, and in addition, the absolutely dizzying complexity of hamlet to incorporated village to unincorporated village to townships, it makes my eyes roll. So I've learned a lot, and I still make a lot of mistakes. Long Island, technically Nassau and Suffolk counties, contains an extraordinary scenery of glacial moraine and outwash plains with picturesque residuals of kettle hole lakes, wooded valleys, rolling meadows, sandy beaches, and rocky coastlines. The numerous indigenous peoples associated with the Algonquin who once occupied these 118 miles subsisted by whaling and fishing and were forcibly displaced by Dutch and English colonists in an oft-told tale. Two reservations remain, the Puspatuk, and the Shinnecock. In the post-Civil War decades, Long Island's landscape assets increasingly drew visitors seeking attractive leisure destinations, an allure which continues today, as you all know. And the coastal fishing communities with their horizon views, the agrarian landscapes with their superior tilth, and the beneficial climate all beckoned the wealthy to establish vast county domain, many with private waterfronts. This transformation of land usage, particularly from the 1880s to the 20th century, forever altered Long Island's economic, political, and social realities with long-term environmental effects, which really do not get explored and scarce until the 1920s or so, and even scarcely then. The multidimensional Olmsted firm was in the vanguard of the architectural advisors required to produce this metamorphosis, together with the property managers, the craftsmen, and the laborers. In the decades around the turn of the century, the firm, under its evolving leadership from the senior Olmsted to Olmsted Brothers, was at the pinnacle of the burgeoning landscape architecture profession, a growing firm of talented men. And Charles has shown one of my images, because they all were all men. The women managed the books, typed the letters, cooked the soup. With projects of all type across the country and in Canada, the partners and their chief associates crisscrossed, attending to far-flung clients or involved with the meetings of the newly formed ASLA, which they had worked to form. Additionally, Frederick Law Olmsted, known as Rick, meaning no disrespect, just easier to refer him to that other than that Olmsted, having initiated the first academic training discipline in landscape architecture at Harvard, was, as Laurie mentioned, rapidly expanding the discipline into corollary professionals of urban planning, and with its own emerging associations. While John Charles, whom I call JCO, advised communities on developing park and parkway armature with associated neighborhoods, as Laurie referred, Rick worked with cities to meet their growing needs and with visionary planning. Such nationwide endeavors involved them with business, civic, and philanthropic leaders throughout the country, many of whom became the clients, with this notable concentration on Long Island. From the 1880s through the nearly 7 decades, the firm, primarily Olmsted Brothers, tackled over 200 projects on the island, most of them between 1900 and 1930. The preponderance of these, 162, are listed under private estates and homesteads, scarcely a small homestead among them. And of those, some of them were mere consultations, but 125 resulted in plans, some numbering in the hundreds. There were 26 commissions for residential subdivisions and resorts, with the planning for Fisher's Island beginning in 1924, generating over 1,000 plans. There are Olmsted projects found in most of the other typologies. And the listing under cemeteries being among the most noteworthy, there are at least 31 projects on Long Island, which is a lot, where there are 41 projects listed under cemeteries and memorials, but if you extract out the cemeteries, that's what you get. That actually is about 14%. I'm bad math, but I've calculated that to be about 14% of the total number across the country of this category, so you get a sense of proportion. So not only did the prominent clientele here choose thoughtful Olmsted surrounds for their dwellings, but they desired that aesthetic to grace their final resting places. The change in economic and social values in the post-Depression, post-war eras made the mansions, as we know, and the land holdings really untenable. Some were gifted to institutions, religious, educational, or cultural. Some became country clubs and land preserves. but many were demolished, the domain thoughtlessly subdivided. More than the loss of bricks and mortar was the loss of landscape artistry and architectural craftsmanship we barely understood, and that we now go to museums to admire, as the DeForests intended in their American wing for the Met. And also, another aspect, as I dig through the Olmsted files, I am amazed by the photographs of the records of great trees being relocated by hand, horse, and barge, not only to provide instant landscapes for these great houses, but often to get these venerable residents away from the path of construction. In this era, respect for these arboreal monuments dictated the shovel and the pulley rather than the axe. Very few of the Long Island projects were from the hand of the master, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., but his design credo and landscape values, his profound respect for the natural conditions and for the power of scenery, and his faith in the restorative effects of nature were fundamental to the work of Olmsted Brothers and to their colleagues and their associates. To celebrate and preserve the unique natural scenery, the firm faced a continuing struggle to moderate the increasingly elaborate architectural embellishments required to serve their clients' expressions of wealth and competitive values. I would not like to have been in some of their diplomatic positions. Beginning in the 1880s, the senior Olmsted advised entrepreneur Bayard Cutting on his 600-acre acquisition in Westbrook. He proposed a simple setting around the new Tudor mansion. I wished I could find a picture of that, and its farmstead. This was a former hunting preserve. He sought to enhance the natural beauty of the rolling meadows, the dense woodlands, and marshy lowlands along the Connecticut, which I gather is the way you pronounce that, river, with recommendations in conjunction with Charles Sprague, Sergeant of the Arboretum, to vary the tree palette and add understory shrubs. Olmsted's desire to protect the expansive English park-like effect was fulfilled in 1952 when the Bayard Cutting Arboretum opened as a state park, ensuring this extraordinary woodland and riverine scenery would remain publicly accessible. In 1881, the Montauk Association, a consortium of financiers, including Brooklyn developer Frank Sherman Benson, requested Olmsted's advice regarding house placement amid the windswept wilderness of southern coastal scrub. He cited picturesque shingle-style structures by McKim, Mead, and White on the high ground in a simple composition, interconnected by paths, to take advantage of views and breezes. Today, the subtlety of this concept is protected as a National Historic Landmark. And as you can see, the green in the guide map, that is some of Frank Sherman Benson's 10,000 acres. In contrast, other properties of Benson's acreage, from Montauk's tip westward, as you could see, along the south coast, followed a more chaotic development path. In 1897-8, anticipating that the Long Island Railroad, where is my Long Island Railroad person, that the Long Island Railroad was planning to construct, there were plans to construct a transatlantic port in this area of Montauk so that the boats wouldn't have to go into New York Harbor, although I don't know why you'd want a long train ride, but that's me. And so he thought that was a useful time to develop the lots. I did not blow up a section of this plan, but I'd like you to look at it closely and imagine yourself Gordon Taylor, the surveyor with whom JCO tramped all this landscape, with a plane table set out there to draw all of those lines of the little lumps and bumps in the landscape, because it's an incredible feat that we really need to celebrate. The idea was to place the houses in such a way that you were working both with the topography and the site features, and so the houses would not have intersecting views. The development scheme, unfortunately, was short-lived. The land was temporarily used instead as a quarantine encampment for the returning Roosevelt Rough Riders to prevent the spread of yellow fever. I think they had also trained there before they went off. In 1904, planning for another Benson residential enterprise further south along the coast, known as Hither Hills, Hither Woods, JCO wrote to his wife that he would regret having houses interrupt the stark sweep of the natural meadows and the shorefront dunes. His wish was to be fulfilled decades later when Robert Moses acquired a lot of this land to become the Hither Hills State Park. But of the rest, a hotel and houses were constructed in the late 1920s by a Florida developer whom Bob Mackay knows all about, Carl Fisher, who attempted to create a club and sportsman's cottage colony before he went bankrupt. Echoes of the Olmsted landscape may still remain in the road layouts around Fort Pond. I can only ground truth from Google. I would love to ground truth on the ground. Another such venture, covering 2,700 acres in the isthmus between the Atlantic and Peconic Bay, reunited childhood friends from Central Park days, JCO and Downing Vox, who was also a landscape architect. Beginning in 1906, they planned the curvilinear roads with diversely sized villa lots, as well as grounds for the Canoe Inn, which I gather still exists, on this rolling terrain. And just to note, which I don't have a pointer, the 3 stops of the Long Island Railroad in the middle of the Shinnecock land. This land was very evocatively depicted by William Merritt Chase, who had an art colony in the area, as well as pre-existing, there was the notable Shinnecock Golf Club of 1895. Although these several stations were included, the area had not yet enough appeal for intended middle-income families, and much of the land remained undeveloped until decades later. This was the last major involvement of JCO on Long Island, as he turned his focus, as we've heard from Lori, to the West Coast, and from Christy, to the West Coast and developing that clientele. Over the succeeding decades, the Olmsted firm would plan approximately 13 more subdivisions from Great Neck to Stony Brook, plus, of course, the major commission for Fisher's Island, which not only was the extent of the island minus some area, which I don't yet totally understand, but there were also 43 individual residential commissions on the island, not included in the 1,000 plans. The other planned communities were of more modest scale, representing commuter neighborhoods. Munsey Park in Manhasset, a project which originated when publisher Frank Munsey left his land to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here, Edward Clark Whiting, beginning in 1927, and in accordance with the neighborhood planning principles that were being espoused by the New York Regional Plan for self-contained neighborhoods with a road system to discourage cut-through traffic. And I gather, because you're going to see this, it'll be wonderful to understand how this fit into the landscape and met the goals intended. Another project, as late as 1951, I was surprised to learn, the firm was engaged in Northport, where partner Carl Rust Parker planned a neighborhood of homes for the Steers Corporation. This planning was to resolve a long-term dispute between the town and 2 sand and gravel operations, Steers and the Metropolitan, about rehabilitating depleted land. While the Steers land along Northport Bay became residential, and you can see it in the slide on your right, in the inlet on the left of that slide. And you can see that on the plan. That did indeed become residential, and a lot of the street layout is very familiar. It looks like what was intended. However, what happened in the metropolitan land, it became a power plant instead. It is at the grander scale of estate planning that the Olmsted work is usually considered. In the decades between the start of World War I and the Depression, numerous residential commissions, some of great size and complexity, as I noted, were being handled simultaneously, and with all the problems that implies of long-distance management. There was a manager left on the ground in Oyster Bay. He was an engineer. His name was John Clune, and we don't know enough about him. So that's a pursuit someone ought to help with if they can. But he was sort of the clerk of the works for all of these projects. More problematic were the issues of design individuality within these very entangled social circles. With their consummate design skills and discretion, the firm managed to surround the often neighboring properties with landscapes of unique distinction without undue repetition of design modalities. And of course, these landscapes had their de rigueur elements. The sunken garden, ebullient with color, texture, and scents. The gracious sunny greenswards, encircled by shadowy woods. Sorry, it was a cloudy day when I first photographed the greensward at Planting Fields. The fountains of the water features of all sorts, introducing reflection and sparkle. The curvilinear or formal approach roads, manipulated for visual surprise. The gazebos and tea houses for sheltered repose at artful vistas, while vine-laden terraces and arbors separated garden rooms. And the endlessly inventive sculptural ornaments to terminate the axes and alleys. Of course, there was always the vegetable and cutting garden, along with the farmsteads and the greenhouses and the cottages where the toilers who managed all this splendor resided. Added to this would be, of course, tennis courts, swimming pools, bridle paths, beach pavilions, really an astonishing inventory to be treated with originality. The North Shore's often dramatic terrain increased the challenges to find what the senior Olmsted termed suitability, the quintessential characteristic to be enhanced on each property. Rick's early engagement in long-range improvement planning for Queens and Brooklyn had brought him into the orbits of Robert DeForest and Frederick Pratt, civic and philanthropic leaders in both New York and Brooklyn, both of whom had sought his advice regarding their Long Island properties. The Pratt family, whose holdings, whoops, did I miss that? So sorry. The Pratt families, whose holdings involved over 1,000 acres in and around Glen Cove, and probably beyond, because I read somewhere they were involved in Montauk as well, so they must have had land holdings there. The land was held in common by the children of Charles Pratt. There were too many Pratts and Platts. Charles Pratt made his money with he was an early petroleum pioneer associated with the Rockefellers. Beginning in 1905, for over 30 years, Rick and the firm advised the Pratt brothers regarding management of their common holdings and garden improvements for their individual properties, which were all clustered around the shore. Their properties were originally wonderful shingle-style structures. They were and clapboard, etc., but they were wood and they were sizable. However, they were no longer of taste. So most of them were torn down and replaced by buildings, more substantial buildings in brick. And when that happened, they had new landscape surrounds, a lot of them by James Greenleaf. But what happened to the earlier Olmsted gardens, we don't know yet. So that's something to go dig in archives about. Welwyn, Harold and Harriet Pratt's estate, was not demolished. Though significantly altered, it also had brick added to it. Here, the remnants of Olmsted planning remain in the approach drive and location of ancillary structures, now mostly graffitied skeleton. What remains of the Olmsted planting recommendations, particularly for the trees, and of the specialized gardens originally designed by James Greenleaf and Martha Brooks Hutchinson, are still to be studied. While the mansion now hosts the Holocaust Memorial and Educational Center, and 200 acres of woods and beachfront have been protected as a Nassau County preserve, echoes of former design intent invite further research on this property. Likewise, the influence of Olmsted planning in shaping Glen Cove on a larger basis would be a worthwhile research project. Rick was consulted in 1907, as early as that, regarding management of the joint undertakings, such as the administrative core, which was known as the Oval, and around which the various stables, but then offices and a lot of other buildings by which they managed their joint property, which included a dairy, extensive pastures, farmsteads, woodlands, indoor and outdoor sports facilities, and so his job was to advise how they should be planning this for future generations to have a landholding, and also that they wanted to protect the scenic landscape features and the view sheds. His idea was that you dealt with this in terms of finding wise management, balancing that with natural forces. How this was carried forth is unclear, but we do know that in 1935, the plan on the right, Harriet Pratt requested street layouts and design for holdings between Crescent Beach and Wolsey Avenue and DeSoris Lane, which he intended to develop. I have not yet ground truthed, but I could see that on Google that a lot of those roads exist. And the other interesting factor is this was a time at which the Hicks Nursery had a road running through it. And there were a lot of plantings at the Hicks Nursery which had to be moved. So Harriet Pratt bought a truckload, carload, trainload, and she intended that they be planted along the streets that she was then that was being planned by the Olmsted firm at this time. Robert DeForest, philanthropist and civic leader extraordinaire and champion of progressive causes, maintained a cordial friendship with Rick, sharing mutual values and concerns. Years before they were going to work on Forest Hills Gardens, funded by the SAGE Foundation, which, as Laurie mentioned, DeForest headed, he consulted Rick on his various landscape holdings on Long Island. He had bought a lot of property, and it doesn't look like all of it got developed, or much of it got developed. A lot of it looks like it's in preserve. At the same time, the firm began work on his brother's property, Nethermuir, evaluating the extant conditions, because the house existed and a garden of sorts existed, which you're seeing a 1925 version after the Olmsteds worked on it, but in the middle on the upper left of the aerial, there's a square area, and that's sort of the end of the garden. But Rick didn't like the way the garden had been laid out. The land, which gets flattened in an aerial, is steeply rolling, and he thought the access roads were entirely too steep, and a lot of trees had been planted, and they were all very crowded. He just didn't think the land worked for itself. With associates Edward Clark Whiting and Harold Hill Blossom, he refined the disparate parts into a remarkably integrated artistic composition, which retained the wooded hillsides, which were steep, with these incredible stone walls. The stonemasons need a lot of credit for those. They're beautiful. And also kept the odd-shaped garden, which was extant, but enhanced it to create a forced perspective. An elevated shelter, a tea house, arbors were added, as well as lush herbaceous borders intersected by axial paths and grass panels. You have your shelters, which are mostly elevated, providing you a look down on the garden structures, on the garden plots. In the rest of the property, he integrated Henry de Forest's home with that of his sister Julia, and with sweeps of mixed tree and shrub plantings. The Olmsted work on Nethermuir lasted until the 1930s. Today, the property, which I think some of you will visit, is part of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. And although it retains some of the trees, it retains echoes of the previous form, the flower garden has become individual private properties, and a road bisects it. The Olmsted firm incorporated the challenging topography into its designs in various ways. In Lloyd Harbor, which also I believe is on the tour, for entrepreneur Roland Conklin in 1912, F.L.O. Jr. had an inspiration of refining, of transforming a steep declivity of west-facing toward the Sound into an amphitheater. His wife, a former opera singer, was planning to have places for performances. Unfortunately, or fortunately, though the idea was accepted, Conklin was an impatient type, and he started to build it himself. So he, instead of following some of the design subtleties that the Olmsteds had intended, he dug out of his extensive landscape the field-dug rounded boulders, which are not of the same character, and built it that way, and somehow managed to get the engineering right so it didn't all collapse. The space, with its 2,000-seat theater, was successfully used for notable performances, particularly for fundraising in World War I. But in 1924, so this is short-lived, in 1924, his wife had died. Conklin sold the property to the Brooklyn Diocese for a seminary. But however, today, thanks to Gina's sleuthing, she has found people with renewed appreciation for this very unusual landscape. For Walter Jennings, a Rockefeller cousin, a lot of them around here, and a Pratt business associate, Rick took advantage of the challenging landforms of a steep bluff on which Burwood was located to develop diverse rooms. In 1915, he worked closely with architect Thomas Hastings, who had built the original house, who had designed the original house, and who was adding wings to it. To one side, Rick designed elegantly proportioned Italianate walled gardens, advising on the numerous sculptures and fountain, while on another he created a subtle terrace overlooking the steep decline down to the water, a ravine garden filled with native plants, which was enhanced by the steps and landings. It was a really extraordinarily articulated landscape of interesting juxtapositions, but it required great maintenance. Somehow in its second life, and I suspect the landscape did not play a part in this, the mansion became a home for the blind. But then it was demolished in 1990, and in the 1990s, so it suffered the fate of something else being built on the property, and I don't know its current status. And maybe, Bob, you do. Less landscape subtlety was required for Otto Kahn's French-inspired Oheka, the grand mansion designed by Delano and Aldrich to echo Biltmore. On an inland site, atop a man-made hill, so Kahn got his views of the water because all the shoreland was already spoken for. And with associates James Dawson and Harold Hill Blossom, another appropriate name for a landscape architect, who was happened to be Dawson's brother-in-law, actually. They refined the proportions of terraces and crafted a water parterre and other accoutrements necessary to embellish such an edifice. Mature trees and evergreens were installed to punctuate the terraces and provide enclosure, while the outer landscape surrounds a woodland were thickened, threaded with bridle paths, some with some intimate gardens and that were created, and all surrounded by an 18-hole golf course. But a mere 400 acres, it was really not a match for Biltmore. And it just did not have enough spatial space in which to get away from the large architectural mass. After her husband's death, Adi Khan was unable to sustain this grand edifice, donated it to the New York sanitation workers as a retreat. Lucky them. It was then sold to a military academy, which frankly trashed the place. And before the academy went bankrupt, causing the property to languish for decades until its slow reincarnation to its present success as a resort destination. But as those of you who have driven around it, are staying there and can see on this aerial, a lot of the property has been subdivided for private residences of much smaller acreage, though the golf course still exists. And I believe the guests have access to it. In contrast, landscape patterning for Olmsted was a more subtle evocation of Olmsted creativity. Here, together with very involved clients, they developed a complex but unified country estate on swampy wooded acreage that was once the hamlet of Laddingtown, and Aldred boasted that Laddingtown was demolished so he could have his view. For utilities magnate John Aldred, Percival Gallagher shaped the landscape into orchestrated spaces with specialized garden apartments. Sorry. You can see from the plan. Acceding to his clients' wishes for an, quote, an American estate with the character of old Tudor England, quote, end quote, he included, among others, an intimate Elizabethan garden with topiary, a formal rose garden bounded by a pleached hornbeam alley, all surrounded in an English-style country park of textured woodlands and expansive meadows. The two sculptural figures, Anthony and the folks at Fairstead, we're going to have to pursue whether these are products of Johann Selmer Larsson, because they show up in the file and they don't usually put in the file things that they're buying from elsewhere. There are also, to contrast with the heavily decorated rooms around the property, around the house, was the outer meadows, the outer lawns, and the views to the Sound. Building out all the intended aspects of Ormston lasted well into the 1930s, by which time Gallagher had died. In a 1935 tribute, Olmsted partner Edward Clark Whiting noted Gallagher was an artist of the land whose ingenuity encompassed the shifting chiaroscuro of atmosphere and colors. The Aldreds had provided him with the freedom to experiment to get just the right effect to make his pictures sing. After the Aldred fortune waned, the estate was purchased in 1944 by a monastic order, which continues to manage it today, adapting the buildings for worship and teaching, and maintaining with pride a much simpler version of the once grand landscape. But it's there. At 25 acres, another property, on rolling land of no particular distinction, La Selva was designed for Henry Sanderson, and it provides a more diminutive gem of Olmsted landscape artistry. 25 acres is not a big plot. But this time, the language of design was Italianate. Here, to surround the villa with its butterfly pattern of embracing wings, the designers created a landscape of more intimate and internal visual interest. Its spatial organization dependent on evergreen-backed columns or high walls as much as on topography and plant groupings. Here the artist was Fred Dawson, working to enlarge the effect of spaciousness with the curving entrance treatment past the decorative vegetable garden. There were terraces, one containing the Elizabethan garden, which overlooked the rolling and wooded terrain, expanding the vistas from the many loggia of this Renaissance-style mansion. The steep hillside below was once embellished, with flowery drifts and heather garden, which we saw the other night, no longer exist. The landscape's most dramatic private world was created within an axial sequence of garden rooms, which we saw the echoes of, enclosed by high columns, wrapped by wisteria, and enlivened by sculptures created by Olmsted firm's own Johann Selmer Larsson. A court garden led to a linear tapis vert, textured by side plantings, which, as you see, Patricia, are very densely enclosed, which in turn led to a terminating colonnade enclosed cirque. It's a mixture of Italianate and French. I'm not quite sure how that all manages. And the pool, your terminating pool, had a simple spray in it. But it was all a unique assemblage in a very limited space. In what remains of that garden, it is the fact that it has incredible new owners who are managing to keep that garden alive, to recapture what they can of its essence and make it sing, is to be congratulated. There are a few highlights from the larger oeuvre of these are a few highlights from the larger oeuvre of design, either in full or in selected parts, by which the Olmsted's distinctive aesthetic shaped Long Island estates. There are many more which bear exploring, uncovering, delayering. Achieving this effect for their Long Island cemetery, in all its undertakings, the Olmsted firm strove for subtle artistry on the land, having a beneficial effect on the spirit. Achieving this effect for their Long Island cemetery clients was most critical, as we've seen. The Olmsted's design, far from the opulence and grandeur of their country estates, the Olmsted designers, let's go back a minute to the opulence of a grand design in a small space. Far from the opulence of the grand estate, the Olmsted designers strove to dignify the personal wishes of each client for their final resting places, enhancing the innate beauty of their chosen sites, yet respecting the integral landforms. In both cemeteries, Memorial Cemetery and Locust Valley, the existing topography was an essential partner in the creation of the aesthetic for family rooms. The quiet discretion of the DeForest family's example, which starts the work at a Memorial Cemetery, set a theme from which the variations emerged, always using a similar palette of native plants, deciduous or evergreen, field stones for paths and walls, and discrete flat monuments. A considerable amount of skillful regrading was required to develop level areas. Slopes retained by various landforms, and the walls were either rustically uncapped or some with bluestone coping, usually set at a height for seating to encourage contemplation. Steps of all characters were there to ensure accessibility. Some were bluestone slabs, others were stepping stones, more in keeping with woodland paths. Some sites used markers to establish the family setting. Others had only gravestones for identification. Some burials were in low vaults. All of these choices dictated by the site conditions and the client's tastes. Too complex to show to a client by paper plan, the Olmsted firm, as Lori mentioned, resorted to model making to illustrate their intentions, which proved a very effective tool. And developing these lots was costly. I can't translate the dollars, but between $2,000 and $6,000 in their money time, and higher when there was greater engineering and construction involved, plus the cost of plants and their installation, which came by the carload. They were either stockpiled the plants from the site, and some clients chose to dig them out of their own landscapes to bring to their cemetery plot. But to get the desired effect of enclosure, large dogwoods and hemlocks were installed, which is why things look a lot barer today, certainly from the loss of the hemlocks. And you get the sense of the multi-layers of the ground plane and the shrub layer, the trees, and the trees now are very tall. And so you really, when you're there, you get a sense of the loss of the intermediary layers. Sorry, I'm having the same problem that John had. These multi-level plantings, from tree canopy to ground cover, textured to provide the flowering trees, shrubs, and perennials, which Dawson remonstrated with Mrs. Alfred Sloan, these plots should not be as gay as a garden. Then as now, there were issues of watering and maintenance. The cemetery had limited upkeep, and there were often these families often hired private gardeners to weed, mow, and prune. And for Memorial Cemetery, there are 21 separate listings, which is extraordinary. And as you can see from my colored version, these are many of these people that I know of now are people who had other landscapes. This coterie of politically powerful civic leaders, bankers, businessmen, philanthropists, whose landscapes and burial grounds the Olmsteds had created were vital to the nascent regional planning efforts for New York. Becoming a city of 5 boroughs in 1898, New York was the hub of a metropolis, which included the Long Island counties, but was beset by uncontrolled population growth, deplorable housing, chaotic transportation, immovable congestion, and fragmentary administration, all of which were unhealthy and certainly bad for business, and these were businessmen. In the 1920s, the Sage Foundation, led by Robert DeForest, the aforementioned with all his credentials, convened the most innovative thinkers from across the country and actually beyond, because Thomas Adams was English, to address the challenges. From this gathering emerged the multi-volume study, The Regional Plan for New York and its Environs, and a self-renewing organization, the Regional Plan Association, now in its 4th regional plan and celebrating its centennial as we speak at Grand Central Station. Rick Olmsted, considered among these leading thinkers, was following his father's work of 60 years earlier. For the senior Olmsted, as Lori has mentioned, and Charles as well, for the senior Olmsted, his park innovations as units or as a system were always considered the critical armature to stimulate a more livable city. A city with green spires of travel routes, with healthy, well-serviced neighborhoods and ample civic open space. In New York, when this was happening, the grid was already too powerful, but the concept took place elsewhere, as we've seen in Boston and Louisville. In 1922, planning at the regional level was a pioneering effort. There were few experienced practitioners with such a broad scope. Little cohesion about data collection. and also about analysis, and almost no political power to enforce, plus minimal funding. That's a disastrous combination. Rick brought to this challenge his landscape perspective, his strategic city planning expertise, his knowledge of Long Island. So it was natural that he was assigned Nassau and Suffolk counties for the report. His main concerns were transportation corridors to connect to the urban core. He advocated for the northern, the southern, and a middle parkway, which, as you all know probably, do get built by the gentleman we'll see next. Protection of historic and ecological resources were also his concern, and the recreational assets of the island. And he was also concerned to develop the administrative and legal mechanisms at the local and county level, i.e., zoning rules, planning commissions, that were going to enable, support, and sustain such planned endeavors. Their tools at the time were acquiring data and then making these rather large maps, which I realize, I apologize, very hard to see on the screen. Long-range environmental considerations and social equity were not yet on the agenda. Enamored by the automobile and unencumbered at that time with ideas of concerns of global warming, Rick and his fellow regional planners thought in terms of green parkway connectors rather than public transit networks for the future, although you already had the Long Island Railroad. Since Long Island was not to be recommended for satellite industrial towns, as they were planning for elsewhere, residential planning was limited mainly to middle-income commuters who could afford a car or could afford the train, and which would also make them much more acceptable as neighbors for the estate clients. Though he frequently clashed with the regional plan as elitist, Robert Moses, who frankly in my mind was a piece of work, under the aegis of both the Port Authority, and you can quote me actually, under the aegis of both the Port Authority or the Long Island State Park Commission, of which he was president, implemented and took credit for many of Rick's ideas. The thoughtful Olmsted estate planning had, in fact, been protective of the large open spaces and special site features, which would later appeal to Moses as preserves, unless he wanted to put a parkway through them. Untangling all these threads is beyond this paper's scope, but really a fascinating study that needs so much more to dig into it. I would make a plea at this point as I conclude that, as we said yesterday, we make sure, Charles has already shared this cartoon with you, that we make sure we give the credit to all layers of the Olmsted firm, but also as a historian and a landscape advocate. I would like to make the plea that we look at all this material that we know. There are really wonderful architectural studies, such as the compendium that Bob Mackay and Splea put together. There's wonderful work being done by the Garden Club of America and documenting the gardens. But in between architecture and gardens, there are other landscape aspects about which we don't know enough. We don't know enough about some of the horticultural remnants that remain. We know there are landscape remnants out there, but we don't know how it all fits together and what has become of it. So it's, to me, as a historian, fascinating, and I recommend it to you all. It is a marvelous journey into archives, into groundscapes, into family narratives, to understand and to celebrate these multiple layers, these, at the moment, many unknown people, and understand that beyond tattered landscape artifacts or degraded vegetation, they represent a rich swath of America's unique cultural patrimony. and our remarkable 100-year legacy of the Olmsted design on the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene, for that wonderful expedition across Long Island and all that good learning. I have a two-part question, and it goes on the foundation of our growing awareness that there are Olmsted projects almost everywhere, and scores of them, as you've illuminated on Long Island. Where I'm going with this is, several times in your illuminating discourse, you used the expression, the Olmsted firm was consulted. What I'm interested to know is how you might open up, unpack what that notion of being consulted meant. Together with the many, many projects that we know that the firm realized, are you equally aware of many that were left on the drafting boards? And together with that, Arlene, is this idea of consulted, does that suggest that the firm has a range of services this side of doing projects that clients would consult them for?
Probably a little bit of the latter, but not really. I'd really like to answer that in a different way. First of all, to get those answers, you need to read the correspondence, because that's what's going to tell you. And there are a lot of job listings, and Anthony can attest to this. There are a lot of job listings with a job number in the Library of Congress, and you go into it, and, oh, my dear, there are 3 letters in it. Dear Mr. Olmsted, would you please come and, here's my Umpty Ump Acres, my back 40. Would you please come? Dear Mr. So-and-so, I would love to come. This is my rate. Dear Mr. Olmsted, you're too expensive. So you have a lot of those. Yeah, exactly. So you have a lot of those. But you also have some where people are indeed going. I think you used the word cachet, or someone used the word cachet yesterday. There's a cachet to the Olmsted name, so therefore you consult with the Olmsteds. Now you may want to consult with them to get their ideas, but you're not going to use them because they're too expensive. And you know, some of these early patrician landowners were utter skinflints. Well, that's another story. But so they wanted the ideas. They also, as in the case of something in Louisville, there's a subdivision in Louisville called Castlewood, and it's drawn by the Olmsted firm. General Castleman was the park commissioner, the Confederate park commissioner who got balanced with the colonel from the Union Army. They got elected periodically. And so, thank you. Castleman was very smart. He asked the Olmsteds to draw up his property as if it were a research, as if it were a subdivision that they had designed, but they didn't. It was designed actually by a local engineer, Cecil Fraser, whom the Olmsteds had hired, but it wasn't designed by the Olmsteds. However, it looks like it's drawn by the Olmsteds, so it's marketed as the Olmsteds. And unless you start pulling across apart those layers, you think you have an Olmsted landscape. And there are a lot of cases like that. Those are the fascinating narratives. Go find them. They're wonderful. They're just, they tell you so much about the people. And I'm all for the people. I'm all to understand who did these things, the no-names who did them. So those guys with the initials on the plans, we can see JFD, but how about EMP? That's Edward Prey. Do we know anything about Edward Prey? Not yet, but we will. So give him a face, give him a talent. Anything else? Thank you. It's been.